It seems weird now, but there was time in football when the role of coach hasn't been perceived as prestigious and important, and even success of the highest caliber couldn't change this view. Real Madrid's memorable triumphs at the dawn of Champions Cup era in the 1950s are lastly associated with the names of managers. It's much the same story with the illustrious Brazilian national team of that period. Very few people could recall who exactly guided it to two consecutive titles at the World Cup. Even back at the time, Vicente Feola and Aimore Moreira, the men who actually did it, have been hardly praised for their deeds. Rightly or wrongly, it's another question. Obviously, there was some exclusion. For instance, the golden era in the history of Ajax in the 1970s is inextricably connected with the monolithic figure of Rinus Michels, which is in a way quite ironic, given that the Dutchman left the club at the very beginning of its dominance in Europe. A decade earlier, the meteoric rise of Inter has been a tribute of Elenio Herrera's meticulous work and his innovative tactics. But as noted earlier, these were isolated cases, to such extent that it was pretty hard for these great managers even to intersect, let alone create a proper rivalry. The other major issue in the distant past has been the structure of football itself. In the situation when it was absolutely impossible to gather all the best players in one tournament, barring the World Cup, which takes place only once every 4 years, the most prominent coaches had no real opportunity to confront and test each other on a regular basis. The sole chance here could provide the domestic leagues, but even there the main football stars were spread out all over the continent, or even all over the world, which is a more correct statement. It's hard to envisage now, but in the 1970s and for the most part of 1980s, 10-12 major domestic leagues in Europe were pretty much comparable in terms of strength, level and class of players. Therefore, all the best ones were more or less evenly distributed across a dozen of different competitions, and the probability of two decorated managers stably meeting each other was pretty low, almost non-existent. Add to this the palpable lack of media attention, and you realize that under those circumstances, the managerial duel a la Guardiola versus Klopp could hardly have happened. Speaking about the insularity of those days, the best example of it perhaps will be the famous rivalry in the Soviet football of the 1980s, Konstantin Beskov versus Valery Lobanovsky, that lasted almost the whole decade and has been the clash of two completely different ideologies. While Beskov was an apologist of romantic combinational football and regarded the game as an art, very much like later Arsène Wenger, the system of Lobanovsky has been based on physical fitness and analytical, basically scientific approach with an obvious emphasis on the net result, at all cost at times. The problem is that as wide and enormous the USSR was, this rivalry has been an internal affair. The public in England, Germany and Italy in general wasn't aware of it. The proper managerial rivalry with a worldwide attention required a platform of brand new size, and in the late 1980s, Serie has been able to build it. Italy, the country where the coaching job has always been a source of great interest and where those who represent it from time immemorial receive grades after each remotely important match alongside with players, lifted focus on football to another level. The Italian league of that period had all the ingredients: best organization, the advanced system of trainings and diet, the biggest attendance, the strongest players, and the most skillful managers indeed. Trapattoni and Sacchi by the time were the most prominent of them, two men with not only completely different tactical ideas and perception of the game, but with the contrasting past as well. The ebullient Giovanni was widely considered the most effective club manager of that decade. Contrary to him, the frenetic Arriga came literally from nowhere, but rapidly became the man in this profession at the helm of AC Milan, courtesy to his special vision of football with accent on high defensive line, pressing, and nifty build-up with well-prepared elements of improvisation. In his first ever season in the Italian top flight, Sacchi won the Scudetto on the way to it, twice beating Trapattoni's Inter, but the latter took the sweet revenge in the following year, establishing a string of various league records. The next two seasons, neither AC Milan nor Inter managed to finish first in the Serie A, but it scarcely damaged the prestige of this duel. Such was the quality of spectacle. Of course, the big part of it was the fantastic selection of players. Arguably for the first time in history, 5, 6, or even 7 out of 10 best European footballers shared the same pitch on a constant basis in the domestic league matches. But not only the craft of Marco van Basten, Ruud Gullit and Franco Baresi from one side, and Lothar Matthäus with Jürgen Klinsmann from the other one, graced those contests. The relentless battles of coaching brains has been the Milan derby's feature as well, and for some well-informed spectators, especially in Italy, the confrontation of man-marking Inter and zonal AC Milan systems of defending was equally curious and attractive. Just like the clash of contrasting football styles, pragmatic the Nerazzurri and attacking, combinational the Rossoneri. Trapattoni himself, though, didn't like at all those kinds of suggestions, angrily stating that over 4 years his team not only scored more goals than the neighbors, but also conceded the bigger amount. It's true, but obviously the beauty of football doesn't measure only by the simple stats, and from a statistical point of view, the games of AC Milan, who used to dominate and score after 20-25 consecutive and mainly witty passes, were more pleasing to the eye. In the 1990s, the Italian league became even more orientated on tactics and various coaching ploys, but paradoxically enough, amid this evolution, it's almost impossible to single out one marquee standoff. The reason behind it is quite simple. Serie A of that period was so incredibly rich on high-profile managers that they usually existed as a whole group, dividing accolades, laurels, and adoration. Less so titles. During almost the entire decade, only Fabio Capello and Marcello Lippi were able to win the Scudetto, but the truth is that they have never participated in the proper championship title race simultaneously during that period of time. In addition to it, Capello was leaving Italy for one season when he took charge of Real Madrid, and then spent a year outside the profession after his return to AC Milan turned into an utter disaster. So there was an obvious lack of continuity, something the famous Ferguson versus Wenger duel has never been short of. The Scotsman and the Frenchman vied for supremacy in the Premier League in 3 different decades. They shared 8 championship titles between 1997 and 2004, finishing 1-2 in 5 of those cases, including 4 in a row. Unlike the Sacchi versus Trapattoni standoff, this particular rivalry has never been a war of different tactical approaches and different philosophies. It may surprise somebody, but the seemingly eternal managers of MU and Arsenal did interpret the game in a more or less similar way. The only serious difference is that the lanky Arsene has been always faithful to a distinctive passing and cutting style of play, and deliberately selected footballers for it, whilst the practical and less romantic Sir Alex was tend to adapt to the personnel he had, relentlessly drifting between combinational and fast football, if necessary, in the face of adversity or menacing opponent. He wasn't shy to add to this a pinch of pragmatism or even the good old British play with a ton of crosses. So it definitely wasn't a clash of styles. It has been just the fierce battle for the best possible result. So fierce that both of them, especially in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, were periodically exchanging unflattering comments and barbs. But in 2013, after Ferguson's retirement, the tone of statements certainly changed, for two obvious reasons. Since that point, they had nothing to fight for, and, which is probably even more important, deep in their hearts, the Scotsman and the Frenchman always strongly respected each other as professionals and individuals, much more than they wanted to show on public during the years of their rivalry. Among all the coaching confrontations, this one was the most discussed, intense, grueling, and the most exciting, of course. In fact, it's an absolute rarity when two great managers not only regularly battle with each other, but do it being in their absolute prime. On a team level, there is an idiom in sport. If you strive to be the best, you should beat the best at first. But this phrase is also valid in relation to coaches. It would be fair to say that Guardiola's reputation and authority came to another, or the current one, if you will, level in the midst of 2010-2011 season, when he was managed to defeat his arch-rival, by that time the most successful in the world in his profession. It's almost forgotten now, but even on the back of first two really prolific years at Barcelona, there was an opinion that the Spaniard is winning courtesy to superior skills of his players and weak opposition in La Liga. But after his season-long battle with Mourinho, who had the resources of same kind, this assertion was disproven. It's significant that whilst his foe improved reputation through this rivalry, it would be fair to say that the Portuguese held his own despite being on the losing end numerically. But if we recall how incredibly mighty we were at Barcelona, we should admit that it's been one of the most masterful José's jobs. It's worth mentioning that both of them paid a heavy price for those unbelievably tough and intense seasons, and this also shows the ultra-boundary level of competition. Guardiola was forced to take a sabbatical in 2012, enduring an enormous stress, as for his counterpart, he stayed at the Santiago Bernabeu for another campaign, but after that he has never been the same. So many energy, emotions and soul he has left in Madrid. The Guardiola versus Mourinho showdown is also unique for a different reason. It had two lives, or it was divided into two chapters, if you will, before 2012 and after that. It's obvious that the importance and incandescence of this battle began to decline after both of them left Spain. In the second half of 2010s, José gradually lost his status as an active world-class manager, and even if he was able to complicate Josep's life from time to time and bite his Manchester City more than on a couple of occasions, the level of public and media interest wasn't the same anymore. The fact that during this confrontation the Portuguese was at the helm of 5 different teams and his counterpart changed clubs throughout this period of time either, also took its toll. The impressions from their first battles were so strong and crisp that everything that followed was a level below, or rather a level below at least. The Klopp versus Guardiola standoff is attractive in the other way. Watching the recent games between Liverpool and Manchester City, it's hard to shake off the feeling that you see the archetype of future football, and then you also realize how much the game evolved in the last 10-15 years. As a matter of fact, in the mid-2000s, it was thought that the lesser you possess the ball, to a certain degree indeed, the better result you will get on a high level. As for the fast football, it has been deemed weird and absolutely unsuitable for winning in the major international tournaments, especially in the knockout stages, where the play had a tendency to slow down with the increasing of pressure, and therefore the teams with a robust defense were getting a huge benefit. And what we witness now, almost all the spots in the Champions League round 16 have been filled or will be by the sides who cultivates either up-tempo style or the one that based on long, nifty build-up. At the same time, those who long time ago fell in love with pragmatism and defense are desperately struggling. Atletico are risking to be eliminated pretty early. Juve already all but mathematically suffered with fate, and Tottenham's position isn't pretty secure also. Basically, 70-80% of modern European prominent clubs are following either Klopp's or Guardiola's footsteps, but nonetheless, the German and the Spaniard are still doing their job better than the others, especially on the long distance. Having said that, both of them tirelessly building on and honing their respective styles, feel no shame taking some elements from each other. For instance, the manager of Liverpool a couple of years ago brought in Thiago Alcantara in order to bolster the face of positional attack, the player who has been molded mostly by Guardiola. On the other hand, Erling Haaland, Manchester City's biggest acquisition of the past few years, in terms of style, is rather a footballer for Klopp's instant and supersonic offense. But in reality, the Norwegian proved and continued to prove that he could be extremely effective in the different system of values and add another dimension to City's tactics. The charm of this particular rivalry is also hidden in its complete unpredictability. Throughout the season, Guardiola used to have an edge. He is far ahead in terms of championship titles, leading his German foe 6-1 if they take their joint campaigns in Bundesliga and Premier League. And so far, there are all reasons to believe that next spring the score will become 7-1. His tools for achieving success are more effective and reliable in general. All in all, whatever quick and fluid the modern football is, some basics remain, and the face of positional attack or defense is still the longest running in almost each match. But in the showdown, these opponents are equally dangerous to each other. During all these years, Klopp has proven himself the bogey adversary for Guardiola, who knows how to hurt his teams badly. There is no wonder the sides headed by the grey-bearded German, be it Borussia Dortmund or Liverpool, are particularly explosive and prolific on the open space, and Josep's teams traditionally left plenty of it at the back. And while most of the opponents couldn't gather the dispersed footballers in a cohesive unit when they finally got the ball, Klopp's outfit is capable of doing it almost every time, because in exactly this transition from defense to attack phase, his coaching talent and brilliance are the most evident. The outcome of the upcoming game will depend on type of flow in which it go, and it's almost impossible to foresee. Meanwhile, Liverpool's current physical and defensive woes shouldn't affect the result directly. These shortcomings rather will play a big role and are already playing it on the long distance. Only one thing is clear. We should see a high-scoring affair at Anfield with at least 3 goals. Otherwise, everything could happen.